There are films that do not lose their atmosphere over time. On the contrary, they become cult classics and slowly build an increasingly dedicated fan base. Sometimes this happens because of perfect casting and a strong visual identity. Sometimes it is simply a matter of timing. But in the case of Underworld, several elements came together at once. An unusual concept, confident execution, and a rare sense of a fully realized world for the genre. The film was released in 2003, but its development began back in the late 1990s. At one point, Paul Anderson was considered for the director's chair, but the project eventually went in a different direction. The film was directed by Len Wiseman, who at the time had no experience directing feature-length films. However, he had already worked extensively in the industry, directing music videos and contributing to large-scale productions as a visual designer. For a debut, it was a risk, but it was precisely this background that helped shape the film's distinctive style. The lead role went to Kate Beckinsale, who had already gained recognition through films like Pearl Harbor and Serendipity. Other actresses were considered at different stages, but Beckinsale proved to be the right choice. Her character, Celine, became one of the film's defining images. The cast was further strengthened by Michael Sheen as Lucian and Bill Nighy as Victor, both of whom added depth and gravitas to the story, especially in moments that relied more on internal conflict than action. The budget was approximately $23 million, which is modest by Hollywood standards for a science fiction action film. As a result, many decisions were pragmatic: fewer expensive sets, more real locations, and a strong emphasis on practical effects and visual discipline. There was little initial hype surrounding the release, partly because Underworld was a rare genre project, not based on a novel or comic book, but on an original story. In the long run, that independence became one of the film's strengths, giving it a clear identity of its own, and that identity is established within the first few minutes. The opening scene functions as a statement of intent. Gothic imagery, rain, cold urban night lighting, sharp contrast, and a strong noir influence immediately define the tone. The camera work, color grading, and practical effects signal that this is not just a modern action film, but a world governed by its own rules. Celine is introduced as a professional hunter. Through her narration, the audience learns about the centuries-long war between vampires and lycans. She is part of an elite vampire task force, conducting operations against an enemy that has become increasingly active in the city. The film quickly makes one thing clear: this is not a fairy tale conflict. It is structured like a war between covert factions, built on surveillance, tactics, and sudden violent encounters. Early in the film, a crucial detail sets Underworld apart from similar stories. Instead of explaining the origin of its creatures through magic or curses, the script frames them as the result of genetic mutation. This does not turn the film into hard science fiction, but it adds internal logic. The world feels less mystical and more physical, as if its rules can be studied rather than simply accepted. The story soon accelerates into action. A pursuit through the subway ends in a shootout, staged to emphasize control rather than chaos. Dark corridors, harsh lighting, a steady rhythm, and constant tension define the scene. At this point, it becomes clear why the film's visual presentation remains memorable. It establishes atmosphere instantly and maintains it with confidence. At this stage, the story is only beginning to unfold. What follows demonstrates how Underworld balances action, creature design, and production choices shaped by a limited budget. As the narrative develops, the film increasingly contrasts the two sides of the conflict through space rather than dialogue. Vampires inhabit grand mansions filled with stone, antique furniture, and dark wood. Their world represents order, hierarchy, and ancient authority. Lycans, by contrast, live beneath the city, in tunnels, abandoned industrial spaces, and underground laboratories. The contrast is immediately readable and functions as a visual metaphor for social division. One of the key figures is Michael Corvin, an ordinary human who suddenly becomes central to the conflict. Played by Scott Speedman, Michael is not designed as an action hero, but as an entry point into the lore. Through him, the film gradually reveals that the war between species is far more complex than it first appears. At the same time, the story of Lucian, the leader of the Lycans, unfolds. Portrayed by Michael Sheen, Lucian is not a conventional villain. His motivation is not destruction, but a desire to change the balance of power. This shift is crucial. The Lycans stop being a faceless enemy, and the conflict gains moral ambiguity. Much of the tension is built through action scenes, many of which were physically demanding behind the scenes. Actor preparation was minimal. Kate Beckinsale had only a few weeks of training, yet the gunplay and wirework appear convincing. Stunt performers later noted that wirework was particularly painful, involving sharp pulls and constant impact. This physical strain contributed to the sharpness and intensity of movement seen on screen. The film's approach to visual effects deserves special mention. Underworld uses CGI extensively, but almost always in combination with practical effects. Lycan transformations, for example, were filmed in multiple stages. The actor was shot on a green screen, then an animatronic creature was filmed separately, and the elements were carefully combined in post-production. The result is transformations that feel physical and tangible rather than purely digital. Many scenes were shot on real locations. Budget constraints pushed the production toward abandoned buildings, underground passages, and industrial environments. This added texture and authenticity, reinforcing the sense of a real city hiding another reality beneath it. Color grading plays a major role. The film is dominated by cold blues and greens, not merely as a stylistic choice, but as a way to separate this world from ordinary reality. Even scenes involving everyday people feel distant, as if they exist on the margins of the story. As Selena becomes more deeply involved in Michael's story, she begins to question her own clan. The behavior of the vampire leader Craven grows increasingly suspicious. His career and decisions seem too carefully constructed. At this point, the film fully abandons a simple good versus evil framework and becomes a story about deception, manipulation, and control over historical truth. It becomes clear that Underworld is compelling not only because of its action, but because of how it reshapes audience expectations. What begins as a stylish action film gradually reveals itself as a story about power, legacy, and rewritten history. As the narrative approaches its central turning point, the film delves deeper into the inner workings of vampire society. Selena repeatedly encounters the limits of the system she serves. Officially, she is an elite warrior, but in reality, she is a tool not meant to ask questions. This dynamic is most evident in her relationship with Craven, whose authority is based on fear rather than respect. A crucial turning point comes with the decision to awaken Victor, one of the oldest and most powerful vampires. For Selene, Victor is not just a leader of the past, but a figure directly tied to her personal history. He is the only one capable of revealing the true origins of the war and Michael's role in it. This moment is thematically significant, marking the film's direct confrontation with the idea of falsified history. Victor's scenes owe much of their impact to Bill Nighy. His character embodies the old order, and his presence feels fundamentally different. Nighy underwent hours of makeup and prosthetic work, wearing complex suits at various stages of Victor's awakening. This was not cosmetic enhancement, but a full physical transformation, reinforcing the film's commitment to practical effects. At the same time, the conspiracy between Craven and Lucian becomes clear. Their alliance is based on mutual benefit rather than trust. Michael stands at the center of their plan, his lineage tied to an ancient bloodline capable of shifting the balance of power. Once again, the film favors internal logic over mysticism. The hybrid concept is presented as a product of experimentation and heredity, not destiny. At this stage, Underworld fully establishes itself as a world without clear heroes. The vampires, initially portrayed as aristocratic guardians of order, reveal themselves to be just as ruthless and deceptive as their enemies. The lycans, despite their aggression, gain understandable motives and goals. The second half of the film escalates in scale while maintaining clear spatial coherence. The attack on the train stands out, combining practical costumes, stunts, and selective CGI. Actors' movements, vehicle shots, and jumps were filmed separately and later assembled through precise editing. The result is a sequence that feels cohesive rather than fragmented. Lycan design deserves particular attention. The filmmakers intentionally avoided the traditional werewolf image. Instead of fur, the creatures emphasize musculature, elongated skulls, and aggressive physicality. This approach was led by effects artist Patrick Tatopoulos, who focused on making the creatures feel physically present. The costumes were heavy, performers used stilts to increase height, and the heads were controlled by separate teams. Even the hair was individually implanted by hand. As a result, the lycans appear not as fairy tale monsters, but as biological predators, fast, dangerous, and real. This reinforces the film's core principle. The world must feel tangible rather than symbolic. By the end of the third act, tension reaches its peak. All major players are drawn into open conflict, and it becomes clear that the existing order will not survive, regardless of who wins. The final act brings all narrative threads into direct confrontation. Plans are exposed, illusions collapse, and the war between vampires and lycans moves into open conflict. Michael completes his transformation into the long-sought hybrid. His change is not framed as triumph, but as a point of no return. The hybrid's design was originally more elaborate, incorporating additional hair and details, but safety and practicality led to a more restrained approach. The final design successfully distinguishes the hybrid from both species, emphasizing his outsider status. The confrontation with Victor serves as the climax of both action and theme. Victor represents an old system built on lies and controlled memory. Through him, Selene learns the truth about her family and how history was deliberately distorted to preserve power. This moment destroys any illusion of noble leadership within vampire society. The action in the finale remains grounded and physical. Despite the fantastical setting, combat relies on real stunts, makeup, and choreography. Bill Nighy, well into his 50s at the time, performed a significant portion of his scenes himself, adding weight and authenticity to the character. The resolution avoids offering a sense of complete victory. The conflict does not end, it merely changes form. Old leaders fall, but the world remains unstable. This sense of incompleteness was one of the reasons the studio approved a sequel before the film even reached theaters. Ultimately, Underworld's legacy lies not in its franchise potential, but in its identity. It stands as a rare early 2000s genre film, built on an original world rather than an existing property. It demonstrated that even with limited resources, a film could create a cohesive, memorable universe through style, design, and internal consistency. That is why Underworld continues to be remembered, revisited, and discussed. Not as a flawless film, but as an example of how atmosphere, visual identity, and thoughtful world building can elevate a straightforward action story into something lasting.